Picture a young Charles Darwin. I don't know about you, but I always imagined him as an intrepid explorer, traveling to the tropical forests of the Americas, writing notes about strange iguanas and finches and butterflies, very far away indeed from the rolling hills of the English countryside. But the island that contributed most to Darwin's incredible theories wasn't some far-flung archipelago in the middle of the Pacific. No, it was this island, Great Britain. And when he returned from his voyage on the Beagle and settled here in this very house in Kent, he was able to observe one distinct family of British plants that would go on to confound and delight him: orchids. A mind-boggling family of plants which would play a surprising role in supporting his theory of evolution. But they often thwarted even his incredible mind. As a Maltese biologist, I've had my fair share of orchid encounters, and like Darwin, I'm a bit obsessed with them, especially how they ensnare the senses of my usual subjects, the insects. Now, I am on a journey to understand the relationship between orchid and insect. I'll be traveling through the English countryside in Darwin's footsteps. Is this flower mimicking an insect? Hunting for orchids along the shores of my Mediterranean home, and heading into the tropical cloud forests of Costa Rica lies deceit and infanticide. Join me on a quest to understand the delightfully devious ways of orchids, from Darwin's day to modern science. Be warned, though, that it's a tale of sex, lies, and obsession. But first, a little backstory. The year is 1859. Darwin has just introduced the world to his theory of evolution, but his rivals are already complaining about a lack of real-world studies to back up his theory. They accuse him of working with speculation, not science. What Darwin needed was a case study. Now, Darwin wasn't too willing to study animals at this moment. Animal evolution was a touchy subject for Darwin's Victorian audience, who placed man at the top of God's creation. His thoughts on apes and humans had landed him in hot water. Darwin needed to shift the focus from animals to plants, because who could get angry about flowers? His work on orchids, he said, would be a flank movement on the enemy. Up until then, the general consensus was that flowers were made by God simply to please humans with their beauty. But if Darwin's theory of evolution was correct, there must have been something more to the seductive flowers of orchids. Why were there so many kinds? And why did they have such strange shapes? Perhaps they had evolved to seduce other creatures. Not humans, but insects. After The Origin of Species was published, Darwin received this book written in German as a gift. It's the life's work of a man called Christian Conrad Sprengel. Sprengel was the headmaster of a school, but when the stress of working in education became too much for him to bear, his doctor suggested spending more time in the great outdoors. And that is where Sprengel fell in love with plants. His book had never been translated to any other language, and for decades lay in obscurity. But Darwin hammered away at his German dictionary, and read a few pages at a time. And what he read astounded him. Sprengel observed that flowers produced a sweet, sugary liquid called nectar, which attracted insects. When they landed for a drink, they got smeared in pollen, which they unwittingly carried to the female parts of the flower, thus ensuring cross-fertilization. What Sprengel had discovered was pollination via insect. Darwin saw an opportunity. For years, he had enjoyed observing orchids as a hobby, but now he had a chance to use them to back up his theories on natural selection. He had to show that the whimsical forms of orchids weren't made by God for human eyes, but they had evolved to seduce insects. He set out on a scientific quest to find out all he could about orchids, and 3 years after publishing On the Origin of Species, he published this, a hefty volume with a very catchy title indeed, on the various contrivances by which orchids are fertilized by insects and on the good effects of intercrossing. He made some astounding observations. And one fateful day, he sat beside these beautiful pink towers, pyramidal orchids, and he decided to wait and see if any insect pollinators came to visit. And lo and behold, a moth fluttered down in front of him and started to reach deep inside the flower with its mouth parts, its proboscis, to try and suck up any nectar deep within. And when it pulled out its tongue, Darwin noticed that it was covered in sacs of pollen. Darwin was awfully curious about the mechanics of this method of pollination. So he poked a pencil in an orchid and observed the pollen sacs that got stuck to it. He watched in amazement as the pollen sacs rotated themselves to be in the best position to stick to the flower's female parts. Clearly, the relationship between insect and flower was a very intimate one indeed. But some orchids would prove to be far more enigmatic for Darwin. One was a spanner in the works, a misfit, not an exotic orchid, but one growing quite innocently on his home turf. It's a characteristically cold and cloudy English spring day, but my spirits aren't dampened because just look at these blooming green-winged orchids. It's a spectacular sight that Darwin himself would have witnessed around his Kentish home. They have all of the hallmarks of a typically good insect-pollinated flower. They have a vibrant color and they pop up proudly from the grass as if they are billboards advertising their merchandise. And that merchandise is of course nectar, the perfect drink for a tired bumblebee, or so it thinks. Darwin found that green-winged orchids produced no nectar. No nectar, no reward. Why on earth were these orchids pollinated at all if insects got nothing in return? Sprengel had suggested that these orchids were deceiving their pollinators, false advertising nectar, which they couldn't be bothered to produce. Darwin could never accept this. Surely insects couldn't be so gullible. But Darwin was wrong. Those Kentish orchids were being deceptive rogues, and what's more, science since Darwin has revealed that orchids use far more evil methods of getting insects to do their bidding. In fact, there are 3 ways to deceive your lover, and nectar deception is by far the least heinous. You may have figured out by now that I'm obsessed with orchids, and this is by far my favorite. There is no British wildflower that comes even close to its beauty, its elegance, its poise, and its downright strangeness. It's a bee orchid. It's got beautiful yellow markings on a brown body, perhaps like a bumblebee, you might say, and strange sepals that come out from behind it, suggesting perhaps a wing, and protuberances here and there, perhaps legs. Is this flower mimicking an insect? Darwin scoffed at the idea. The notion that a plant could mimic an animal seemed perverse to him. And even if it could, why would it? The mystery of the insect-like orchids would not be solved until 35 years after Darwin's passing. A mystery solved thanks to orchids which I can find back home in Malta, if I look hard enough. In 1917, a French amateur botanist called Pouyan was busy falling in love with Mediterranean orchids like this one, the mirror orchid. He noticed it had a most bizarre petal, this one a very enlarged petal covered in reddish-brown hairs and a most beautiful blue polished centre. What on earth pollinates this bizarre plant? It's every bit as weird and unconventional as Darwin's bee orchid back in Kent. Well, if I leave my camera nearby and wait for a few hours, I'll be able to see exactly what Pouyan saw over 100 years ago that changed the world of botany forever. At first, it seems that no one at all is interested in what this little flower has to offer. But then, finally, a visitor. This orchid is only visited by one species of wasp, and only males. Pouyan had made a breakthrough. These orchids were trying to attract insects, not with the promise of food, but the promise of sex. The second way to deceive your lover. The orchids produced an intoxicating cocktail of airborne chemicals identical to the sex pheromones produced by female wasps. The hairy texture and insect-like shape of the orchid provide the looks to go along with the perfume. In the process of mating, pollen is attached to the wasp, and when he goes off to mate with another orchid, cross-fertilization is achieved. Pouyan observed this in various orchids. This was another of his subjects, the bumblebee orchid. To human eyes, it has none of the characteristics of a proper flower. But to this male longhorn bee, she's perfect.
When you're beating wings and your fleeting sting grows weary, I'll share my sweet perfume and swoon till you are near me. When my petals meet your precious feet, it's only a matter of time.
Unfortunately for Darwin, he would have never been able to witness the pollination of bee orchids back in Kent because England is far too cold for its usual pollinators. Instead, the flowers rely on self-fertilization. Here, even a gust of wind is enough to knock the pollen into place, or a gentle prod with a blade of grass. So Darwin was in the wrong place, geographically speaking, to make sense of the flower's strange shape and colour. But I wonder, if he had seen it in action, if he had seen a male sex-crazed bee trying to mate with this flower, what would he have made of it? For the third way in which orchids deceive their unwitting pollinators, I will have to leave Europe altogether and head for the cloud forests of Costa Rica. You might think I've flown halfway across the world to see some brilliantly colored orchid, something typical of the extravagance of the tropics. But what I've come to find is this remarkable, tiny orchid called Dracula, and it's so named because it tends to inhabit the gloomy, dark understory of the forest. A very strange place to be, you might think, to attract pollinators. It's got none of the brilliant hues of its cousins here in Costa Rica, and rather than point upward or outward from a tree trunk, it's pointing downward. It wants to attract something that's scurrying about amongst the leaf litter. And as for fragrance, certainly not something that I would call a sweet perfume, more like the smell of a dank cellar with mold growing on the walls, because that's exactly what Dracula mimics, a fungus. The humid rainforest floor is the perfect place to find mushrooms. And where there are mushrooms, there are mushroom flies, Zygothrika. Mushrooms are a rich source of protein for their larvae. The central lip of Dracula orchids has evolved to look like and smell like a mushroom. Pregnant Zygothrika females are quick to investigate. But if they stray too far inside the flower, the lip flips upwards, holding them in a vice-like grip. As they struggle to free themselves, the flies are dabbed with a packet of pollen. So Dracula isn't luring these expectant mothers with the promise of a sexual partner, but by mimicking a good place to lay their eggs. But here in Costa Rica, there are some far more sinister orchids. This bizarre orchid is Phragmipedium, one of the lady's slipper orchids. It's got a lot of bizarre features, but perhaps its most characteristic one is this, a huge hollow tank. It's actually large enough to accommodate my little finger. Now, Darwin saw many kinds of lady slipper orchids, and he was very confused by their shape, and rightly so. Darwin supposed that the bottom of the tank must fill up with a sugary mixture, nectar, that some insect like a moth or a butterfly could reach into with its long tongue. But he was wrong, because these orchids are designed to trap insects, not to feed them. And as it turns out, Phragmipedium traps them in the cruelest manner. Hoverfly larvae love to feast on aphids, small sap-sucking insects. The orchid's throat is covered in warty spots, as if the plant is infested with aphid colonies. Perfect food for a growing hoverfly. So pregnant hoverflies are attracted to the orchid, thinking that it's a good place to lay their eggs. But they've been fooled. Hoverfly after hoverfly lands and slips into the tank. The hoverflies are forced to climb through the only exit, a narrow stairway at the back of the tank, in the form of hairs that travel all the way up to the top, to a tunnel packed with pollen. For some, this is where the story ends. Too big to pass through, the fly gets stuck and dies of starvation. But others manage to squeeze through. And as they do so, they are dabbed with a packet of pollen. Though these mothers may escape with their lives, their young are far less fortunate, because any eggs they lay on this orchid will hatch to find nothing to eat. They will starve to death. So again, there are no rewards on offer for the pollinators of this orchid, only false hope, lies, and infanticide. Perhaps we've been a bit harsh with Darwin. Yes, he did not accept that some orchids deceive their pollinators, and that was incorrect. They do. But he was much better at figuring out the hidden meaning behind the structure of more honest flowers, like these pyramidal orchids. The flowers of pyramidal orchids and butterfly orchids have long tubes called nectar spurs. At the very tip of each spur, there's a small amount of that sweet, sugary liquid that moths and butterflies crave so much. To Darwin's incredible mind, the story was simple. Over generations, the tongues of moths and butterflies got longer and longer to better extract nectar. So orchids responded by growing even longer spurs, forcing them to reach deep inside, and in the process get a payload of pollen. So Darwin had struck upon a momentous idea that plant and animal could evolve together to satisfy each other's needs. In other words, co-evolution. So, at last, Darwin's fascination with orchids was paying off. He had shown that their endless forms had evolved to enrapture insects. They hadn't been created by God for the eyes of man. But now Darwin was about to go all in, a make or break gamble that could prove his theory of co-evolution right or sink it. Darwin was lucky enough to have many rich friends around the world who sent him back tropical orchids, and this one from Madagascar blew his mind. Its name is ungraecum. Here you can see the lovely petals, which in life would have been a lovely white color, and this remarkable appendage, it's incredibly long, that trails behind the flower, is a nectar spur. So whatever insect pollinates this orchid, whatever insect needs to get at that nectar, needs to have an incredibly long and remarkable tool to extract it. Or, to use Darwin's own words when he first saw ungraecum, good heavens, what insect can suck it? Darwin knew there were moths out there with very long tongues indeed, but certainly none that were known to have one over 30 centimeters long. Darwin didn't care. He had complete faith in his theory of co-evolution. In a moment of brazenness, Darwin made a prediction. A moth with a foot-long tongue must exist somewhere deep in Madagascar, for only such an anatomical oddity could possibly pollinate this orchid. Darwin's detractors were ready to pounce. George Campbell, the 8th Duke of Argyll and fierce opponent of Darwin, called his predictions nothing but the vaguest and most unsatisfactory conjectures. A sick burn, if there ever was one. But sure enough, 21 years after Darwin's death, a moth with a foot-long tongue was discovered in Madagascar. Vindication. It was the first and only time a species was predicted to exist before it was even discovered. A decisive victory for the theory of co-evolution. Darwin's obsession with orchids revealed the fantastic truth about how species evolve together, one dependent on the other. True, he was wrong about the morality of some orchids. Perhaps they deceived Darwin just as easily as they deceive their pollinators. But his orchid-inspired ideas on co-evolution changed the way we look at the natural world forever. So it was on an English hillside where Darwin would go out to study orchids, not very far from his home in Kent, where he was inspired to write his most famous passage of all, written in his characteristic, flawless Victorian prose. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. From so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved.
When you're beating wings and your fleeting sting grows weary, I'll share my sweet perfume and swoon till you are near me. When my petals meet your precious feet, it's only a matter of time. I'll bloom for you and consume you. If ever you try to abandon my side, oh darling, you'll be doomed. I'll give you all your dreaming on. Just one sip of wine and you'll be mine to entomb with my love.